Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share this quiet hour with you. Tell me, is there a book nearby? Perhaps a cup of tea grown gently cold beside your chair? In such still moments, Watson understood that truth rarely announces itself. It waits, patient and precise, pressed into the margins where only the careful eye will find it. Tonight's story is one of ink, scholarship, and a secret encoded for a reader yet unknown. Do subscribe so no detail escapes you. Now settle in, for as Holmes believed, one must first learn to see before one can ever hope to understand. You'll find the Watson's Margin Spotify channel linked in the description below. Chapter 1: A Visitor in the Fog. There are mornings in November when London seems to retreat entirely from the world of men, wrapping itself in a grey and sulphurous mantle so thick that the eye cannot carry 20 yards in any direction. On such a morning I have known Baker Street to become a place of perfect isolation. The clatter of the hansoms muffled to a soft shuffling, the gas lamps reduced to pale smudges of amber in the murk, the whole great city reduced for an hour or two to the circumference of a single room. It was on precisely such a morning that the affair I intend to chronicle had its beginning. I had breakfasted early and found Holmes already at his work, or rather, at that peculiar species of idleness which invariably preceded his most intense periods of activity. He was seated in his armchair beside the unlit fire, his long legs stretched before him, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin in the attitude I had come to recognize as meditative. A number of papers lay on the deal table beside him, and a magnifying lens had been placed upon them with a care that suggested recent use. The room smelled of cold pipe smoke, and the faint chemical sharpness that clung always to his experiments, though this morning he had apparently abandoned the bench entirely. I settled opposite him with my newspaper, but found it difficult to concentrate. The fog pressed against the window glass with an almost physical insistence, and the silence of the street outside lent the morning an oppressive quality that was not entirely comfortable. Holmes had not spoken in some 3/4 of an hour. When at last he did, it was without opening his eyes. "You're finding the personal columns unrewarding this morning, Watson." I lowered the paper and regarded him with a mild exasperation that I was no longer at pains to conceal. "I have not yet reached the personal columns," I replied. "I have been attempting the leading article. You have turned the same page 4 times in as many minutes. Concentration eludes you. The fog, no doubt. It has that effect on men of active temperament who find themselves confined." I made some reply to this, but before the matter could develop further, we were interrupted by the sound of Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stair, quick, purposeful, and accompanied by the lighter footfall of someone ascending behind her. Holmes opened his eyes at once. He had, as I had many times observed, the faculty of passing from apparent somnolence to absolute alertness in an instant, as though some internal mechanism had been tripped. "A visitor," he said quietly, "and an agitated one. The step is uneven. He has paused twice on the stair. Hesitation, not infirmity. A man conducting an internal argument about whether to proceed." Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door with a look of mild reservation that I had come to associate with clients of the more anxious variety. "Mr. Whittington to see you, Mr. Holmes. He is most insistent, though I told him you were not to be." "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson, if you would be so good." The gentleman who entered our sitting room was perhaps 50 years of age, respectably dressed in a dark overcoat still beaded with the moisture of the fog outside. He was of middling height, with a broad, pale forehead and the slightly ink-stained fingers of a man who worked habitually among documents. His eyes were quick and intelligent, but betrayed, as Holmes had predicted, the restlessness of a man in the grip of considerable anxiety. Under one arm he carried, with a solicitude that was plainly habitual, a flat rectangular parcel wrapped in oilskin. He looked between us uncertainly, and Holmes directed him to the basket chair with a gesture. "Mr. Adrian Whittington," said Holmes before our visitor had introduced himself. "Antiquarian bookseller, Bloomsbury." You have recently acquired a manuscript from the estate of a deceased scholar, and that manuscript is now causing you considerable distress. Please sit down and tell me the whole affair, beginning not with what you believe to be relevant, but with everything, in the order in which it occurred to you." Whittington stared at him for a moment with an expression I recognised, that curious compound of astonishment and relief which came over many of Holmes's clients, when they realised they had come to the right man. "Mr. Holmes," he said, taking the indicated chair, "you are precisely as described. I am indeed a bookseller, and the matter is precisely as you say, though I confess I cannot imagine how. The ink on the third and fourth fingers of your right hand is carbon-based and very old, the kind used by cataloguers of ancient materials, not printers or clerks. The oilskin parcel is the size and shape of a quarto volume and has been handled a great deal this morning. The creases are fresh. Your coat is from Bloomsbury, and your bootmaker is that same neighbourhood. These are trifles. Pray continue." Whittington set the parcel upon his knee and drew a steadying breath before speaking. "The manuscript," he began, "came to me some 3 weeks ago as part of a collection from the estate of Professor Lionel Ashcroft, a classical scholar of considerable reputation, lately of University College. I had dealt with Professor Ashcroft on several previous occasions, and had always found him scrupulous in his provenance. The collection was purchased in its entirety. I catalogued each item personally. And the manuscript in question," Holmes said, "a Latin treatise of the Renaissance period, a minor philosophical text, moderately interesting to specialists but not of exceptional monetary value. I catalogued it as clean. The margins were entirely clear." He paused. "They are no longer so." He unwrapped the oilskin as he spoke and placed upon the table before Holmes a volume of some age, its boards worn at the corners, its spine slightly faded, which I judged to be a quarto of some 300 pages. Holmes leaned forward immediately. The volume lay open at a page near the centre, and even from my chair I could see, running along the inner margin in a hand that was unmistakably recent, a series of annotations in a crimson ink so vivid against the aged vellum that they seemed almost to pulse with an unnatural vitality. "Good heavens," I said before I could prevent myself. Holmes did not speak at all for some moments. He had produced his lens and held it above the page with the steady hand of a surgeon, his grey eyes moving with slow precision along the line of marks. The annotations were not of the ordinary scholarly variety, not cross-references or glosses upon the Latin text, but something altogether more cryptic, strings of letters, numerals, and abbreviated phrases that appeared to bear no relation to the passage they adjoined. "These were not present when you catalogued the volume," Holmes said at last. It was not a question. "Upon my honour, they were not. I would stake my professional reputation on it. How many pages are affected?" When I first noticed them, some 5 days ago, there were perhaps a dozen pages. I have not counted since. I confess I have been unwilling to examine it too closely. Holmes set the lens down slowly and looked at Whittington with an expression of focused attention. "You said the manuscript came from Professor Ashcroft's estate. The professor himself is deceased. He died in September. The estate was settled in October and the collection dispersed shortly thereafter. And since you acquired the volume, has it passed from your physical custody at any time?" Whittington hesitated, and in that hesitation Holmes became, if possible, even more still. "It was examined," Whittington said carefully, "by Mr. Leonard Brooks, a dealer in second-hand books, not a man of great repute, but known to me. He called upon me and expressed an interest in the Ashcroft collection generally. I showed him several items. He spent some time with the manuscript. And Mr. Brooks, he's currently available for questioning?" There was a short silence. Outside, a carriage passed in the fog with the muffled urgency of a sound heard through wool. "That is rather the point, Mr. Holmes," said Whittington quietly. "Mr. Brooks was found dead in his shop 2 days ago. The police are calling it self-destruction." Holmes rose from his chair and went to the window. He stood with his back to us for a long moment, looking out into the opaque grey nothing of the November street. When he turned, His expression was one I had seen before, the particular, almost kindled look that came upon him when a problem of genuine quality had presented itself. "Watson," he said, "I believe we shall want our coats and hats. Mr. Whittington, you will oblige me by leaving the manuscript here for the present. It will be perfectly safe, I assure you, and returning this afternoon at 3 o'clock. There are several questions I shall wish to put to you then. In the meantime, I have some preliminary matters to attend to." Whittington left us with evident relief at having transferred some portion of his burden. Holmes, when the door had closed, stood for a moment regarding the volume upon the table without touching it. His expression had taken on the abstracted quality that I knew indicated genuine intellectual engagement. "A death, Watson," he said at last, "and a manuscript with annotations that were not there before. Most men would begin with the death. And you?" I asked. He touched the crimson Marginalia with one careful fingertip and said nothing for a moment. "I begin," he said quietly, "with the colour of the ink, Chapter 2, The Circle of Scholars." The fog had not lifted by the time we arrived in Bloomsbury, though it had thinned somewhat, exchanging its earlier opacity for a pale, diffused greyness that softened the Georgian terraces and made the plane trees along the square appear as though sketched in charcoal and then partially erased. Whittington had given us the address of the late Professor Ashcroft's residence, a substantial house in one of the quieter streets north of the museum, and it was there that Holmes directed our cab, having spent the journey in complete silence with his chin buried in his coat collar and his eyes upon nothing in particular. I had learned long ago not to interrupt these silences. They were not moods, but methods. The house was answered by a composed young woman of perhaps 28, dark-haired and plainly dressed, whose bearing suggested both intelligence and a recent familiarity with grief. She introduced herself as Miss Clara Ashcroft, the Professor's niece, and received us with a quiet civility that I found admirable under the circumstances. The sitting-room into which she led us was a scholar's room, not disordered but layered, the surfaces occupied by books and papers in that particular arrangement which suggests a mind that imposed its own logic upon objects regardless of conventional tidiness. A man was already there, rising as we entered. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the deliberate courtesy of an academic who had spent decades navigating the sensitivities of colleagues. He introduced himself as Dr. Edwin Mallory and named himself as Ashcroft's closest friend and fellow historian. His handshake was firm, his expression one of measured sympathy, and he spoke of the Professor with a warmth that struck me as entirely genuine. A third figure hovered near the window, young, perhaps 25, with an anxious quality about him that no quantity of careful stillness could quite suppress. This was Thomas Larkspur, introduced as the Professor's research assistant. He had a scholar's stoop and a recent bruise of sleeplessness beneath his eyes, and he watched Holmes with the wary attention of a man unsure whether the arrival of a detective represented salvation or danger. Holmes said very little during the introductions. He accepted a chair, declined tea, and proceeded to examine the room with the unhurried attention of a man who has come to read rather than to be read to. It was Mallory who spoke first of substance, folding his hands upon his knee with the ease of a man accustomed to ordering his thoughts. "I understand, Mr. Holmes, that you are here in connection with the manuscript from Lionel's collection. I confess I find the whole business most distressing. Lionel was a meticulous scholar. The idea that his papers should now be embroiled in what sounds uncomfortably like criminal proceedings, it is deeply unwelcome." "You were acquainted with the manuscript itself?" Holmes asked. "In a general way. Lionel had a considerable collection of Renaissance texts. He referred to this particular volume in conversation on 1 or 2 occasions, though I cannot claim to have examined it personally." Holmes turned to Miss Ashcroft. "And you, Miss Ashcroft? Were you aware of it?" "My uncle spoke of all his acquisitions," she replied. She had seated herself very upright in the chair opposite, her hands folded, her eyes level. He was not secretive about his work, he was proud of it. She paused in a way that I felt contained something unspoken, and then added, "He became less communicative in his final weeks. He was preoccupied." "Preoccupied with what, would you say?" A brief hesitation. "He did not confide in me directly, but he was disturbed. He slept poorly. He received letters that he did not show me and destroyed rather than filed." She glanced once at Mallory, and the glance was quick enough that I might have missed it had I not been watching. I assumed it was a professional matter. Larkspur had said nothing thus far, and Holmes now addressed him with a directness that caused the young man to straighten against the window frame. "You had regular access to the Professor's library, Mr. Larkspur." "I did. It was my work. I was cataloguing the secondary sources for his current project, a study of classical forgeries." He said this last without apparent irony, though the word fell into the room with a weight that I do not think any of us entirely missed. I had no particular involvement with the Renaissance collection. My work was in the Greek and Latin printed texts, the more modern materials. And the manuscript that is now in Mr. Whittington's possession, did you handle it? "Once, perhaps, in passing. It was not relevant to my work." Holmes nodded slowly and said nothing further to him, which seemed, paradoxically, to increase Larkspur's unease rather than diminish it. We were shortly joined by Inspector Lestrade, who arrived with the slightly proprietorial air of a man who suspects that the presence of Sherlock Holmes on his ground implies a criticism he has not yet been given the opportunity to rebut. He was investigating the death of Leonard Brooks, he informed us, and the matter was, in his considered opinion, straightforward. "Debts, Mr. Holmes," he said, accepting the tea that Holmes had declined. The man was in considerable financial difficulty. The laudanum was his own, prescribed apparently for a chronic complaint of some years' standing. The dose was substantially in excess of any therapeutic quantity. His affairs were in disorder, and there was no sign of disturbance in the shop. "No sign of a visitor?" Holmes asked. "None that we could identify. The door was locked from within." "The inner latch or the mortise?" Lestrade paused. "The inner latch," he said, with the fractional reluctance of a man conceding a point he had not previously considered significant. Holmes said nothing. He had risen while Lestrade spoke and drifted, apparently aimlessly, though I knew better, toward the bookshelves that lined the far wall of the room. His eyes were moving along the spines, and once or twice his hand rose to touch a volume lightly before withdrawing. "I should like," he said presently, addressing Miss Ashcroft, "to see your uncle's study if you would permit it." She led us down a narrow passage to a room at the rear of the house, book-lined and north-facing, with a large writing table placed before the window. It had the still quality of a room that has not been regularly inhabited since its owner's death. The papers squared and covered, the pen tray set at a precise angle that spoke of someone else's tidying rather than the Professor's own habits. Holmes went to the writing table and stood before it without touching anything. He examined the surface, the pen tray, the small covered inkwell to the left. "Miss Ashcroft," he said quietly, "was your uncle accustomed to working with coloured inks?" She looked briefly surprised. "He used black as a rule, occasionally blue for annotations he wished to distinguish, but—" She stopped. "But?" Holmes prompted with the gentlest possible insistence. "There was a small bottle on this table in the weeks before he died. A deep red, crimson, I suppose one would call it. I assumed it was for some specialised notation. It was gone by the time I came to arrange the room after his death. I did not think to mention it." Holmes turned from the table and looked at me. He said nothing, but in his expression I read the particular quality of satisfaction that came not from solving a problem, but from confirming that the problem was, in fact, precisely as interesting as he had hoped. On the way back through the sitting room, I noticed something that Holmes had apparently observed considerably earlier. Upon the small writing desk beside Mallory's chair, there sat, half concealed beneath a folded journal, a glass bottle of perhaps 2 ounces capacity. The label was turned inward, but the glass itself was tinted, and where the stopper met the neck, a faint residue caught the grey light from the window. The residue was the deep, unmistakable colour of old blood, or of very fresh crimson ink. Holmes walked past it without a glance. But as we stepped into the hall, he murmured to me, so quietly that I had to lean close to catch the words at all, "My dear Watson, marginal notes are often the truest biography of a scholar's mind. Yet these," he said, "are the biography of something else entirely." Chapter 3. The Bookseller's Death. We returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon to find Whittington already waiting, seated in the basket chair with the punctuality of a man whose anxiety has converted itself into mere restlessness. Holmes waved aside his opening questions, settled himself at the table with the manuscript before him, and for the better part of 20 minutes gave the volume his entire attention, while our client and I sat in a silence that was, on Whittington's part at least, increasingly difficult to sustain. I occupied myself with my notes. I had formed the habit, over many years of association with Holmes, of committing the particulars of a case to paper while they were still fresh, and the morning had furnished a considerable quantity of particulars worth recording. Miss Ashcroft's careful reticence, Larkspur's vigilant unease, Mallory's easy warmth, and the bottle half hidden beneath his journal. None of these, taken alone, amounted to anything that Lestrade would have called evidence. Taken together, they formed the kind of atmospheric suggestion that Holmes invariably transformed, by some alchemy of his own, into something considerably more solid. He looked up at last from the manuscript. "Mr. Whittington, since you first observed the annotations, has anyone else had access to this volume? I mean anyone at all. A customer who examined it, a colleague who called, a porter who might have been left alone with it for 10 minutes. Whittington considered this with the care it deserved. "No one, Mr. Holmes. I have kept it in my private cabinet since I noticed the markings. The cabinet locks. I carry the key. And before you noticed them, during the general period following your acquisition of the Ashcroft collection, the shop was open as usual. Any number of people passed through in the course of a week, but the Ashcroft materials were set apart for cataloguing. They were not on open display." "Brooks," Holmes said, "you told me this morning that he examined the manuscript. How long was he alone with it?" "Perhaps half an hour. He came on a Tuesday. I was called to the telephone in the back office twice during his visit. He was a dealer, Mr. Holmes, not a thief. I had no reason for particular vigilance." Holmes received this without comment and returned his attention to the volume. He turned the pages with great deliberateness, pausing at intervals and once or twice bringing the lens to bear on a section of the inner margin, with an expression of concentrated interest. Then he closed the volume and pressed his fingertips together in the manner I knew well. "The annotations have been added to since yesterday," he said. Whittington came half out of his chair. "That is impossible. I told you, the cabinet. Nevertheless, there are 3 pages bearing marks that show no surface oxidation whatsoever. The ink is not yet fully set. These were written within the last 18 hours. He paused. "You're absolutely certain no one else possesses a key to that cabinet?" The colour had left Whittington's face. "Absolutely certain," he said, though with rather less conviction than the words required. It was at this juncture that a telegram arrived. Brought up by Mrs. Hudson with the slight elevation of eyebrow she reserved for communications that struck her as urgent. Holmes read it, handed it to me without remark, and rose to take his coat from the hook by the door. The telegram was from Lestrade. It read, "Brooks' inquest opened this morning. Further evidence emerged. Suggest you attend shop in Chandos Lane this afternoon, if convenient. Not suicide, entirely certain." Chandos Lane proved to be a narrow street in the shadow of Covent Garden, its character a mixture of the commercial and the faded, the kind of place where a second-hand bookseller might sustain a modest trade without either prospering or entirely failing. The shop of Leonard Brooks occupied the ground floor of a narrow building, its bow window still displaying a modest arrangement of volumes that no one had thought to remove. A constable stood at the door. Inside, Lestrade met us with an expression that balanced professional dignity against the evident relief of a man who has encountered a complication he would prefer someone else to resolve. "Glad you could come, Mr. Holmes. There are one or two things that don't sit quite right." The shop was small and close, its shelves extending from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, a writing desk occupying the space behind the counter. The room smelled of paper and dust and something else beneath these, an odour medicinal and faintly sweet that I identified at once from my years of practice. Lestrade directed our attention first to the desk. Upon it lay, as he had described, a brown glass bottle of laudanum, its stopper beside it. Next to this, a small glass. A chair was drawn up to the desk as though the occupant had simply sat down one last time and declined to rise again. "The medical examiner confirms a fatal quantity," Lestrade said. "But here is what troubles me." He produced a folded paper from his coat, a single sheet, written upon in a neat commercial hand. It was a list of names, 7 in total. I scanned them quickly, and my eye arrested upon 3 that I recognised. Whittington, Mallory, Ashcroft. Holmes had seen them too. He was already at the desk, examining it without touching anything, his eyes moving across its surface in that systematic way of his that resembled nothing so much as reading. "The list was in the centre drawer," Lestrade said. "Locked. We found the key in his waistcoat." "When was the drawer last known to be opened?" "We cannot say with certainty." Holmes straightened and looked about the room with a measuring attention. He went to the window first, a small casement giving onto a yard at the rear, and examined the latch and the frame. Then he crossed to the door, studied the lock and the inner face of the jamb, and stood for a moment in evident thought. "The latch," he said. "You told me this morning it was secured from within. An inner latch of the thumb-turn variety, I take it." "That's right. We had to force the lower window to gain entry. And yet the lower window shows no corresponding sign of having been recently forced from without." He glanced at Lestrade with the measured patience of a schoolmaster awaiting a pupil's correction of his own error. "You will find, I think, that the thumb-turn can be operated from without if the gap between door and frame is sufficient to admit a thin implement. A pocket-knife blade or a stiff wire would serve adequately. The door frame in this building has warped with age. The gap on the latch side is nearly 1/4 of an inch." Lestrade looked at the door with an expression he was making some effort to keep neutral. Holmes had moved on. He was at the shelves now, running his eye along the spines. Not, I thought, in search of any particular title, but reading the shelves as a whole, the way one reads a room for what has been disturbed. He stopped at a section to the left of the window where a small gap between volumes indicated a recent removal. "Something has been taken from here," he said. "We found no book unaccounted for," Lestrade said, "which suggests it was not a book." Holmes measured the gap with his eye. "The space is the right size for a small ledger. A record of transactions, perhaps, or of correspondence. Something Brooks kept close at hand and someone else found it necessary to remove." I had been watching from near the door, and it was from this position that I noticed what Holmes and Lestrade had not yet turned to observe. The manuscript, Whittington's manuscript, which Holmes had brought with him in its oilskin wrapping and set upon the counter upon entering, lay exactly where Holmes had placed it. But the oilskin, I was quite certain, had been folded shut. It was now very slightly open at one corner, as though the package had been disturbed and imperfectly reclosed. I said nothing until we were outside. Then I told Holmes quietly what I had observed. He did not look at me immediately. He stood for a moment on the pavement of Chandos Lane, the fog thickening again around us toward the early dark, and a particular stillness came over him. "Someone in that room," he said at last, very low, "opened the manuscript while Lestrade and I were occupied, and that someone wished to know whether the message could still be read." He turned up his collar against the cold. "Which means, Watson, that the message is still there to be found, and that our murderer is not yet finished with it." He walked on toward the main road, and I fell into step beside him with the familiar sensation, unsettling and not entirely unpleasant, of standing at the threshold of a darkness that Holmes alone could see how to illuminate. Chapter 4. The Language of the Margins. That evening Holmes did not dine. I had come to regard this as a reliable indicator of the seriousness with which he was engaged, for he was not, under ordinary circumstances, indifferent to food. Mrs. Hudson sent up a tray at 7 o'clock, and it remained, I noticed, when I came down from my room at 8:30, almost entirely untouched. Holmes himself was at the table, the manuscript open before him, the lamp drawn close, and his magnifying lens moving across the pages with the patient regularity of a man who has committed himself to a very long piece of work. I settled in the armchair with a medical journal, but found, as I had in the morning, that concentration was not readily available. There was something about watching Holmes at this particular kind of work, silent, deliberate, absorbed, that made ordinary reading feel faintly impertinent. After a time I gave it up and simply watched him, which he tolerated with the equanimity of a man who has entirely ceased to notice whether he is observed. He had arranged beside him a sheet of foolscap on which he was constructing, in his small and precise hand, a table of some kind. Each entry was brief, a page number, a letter or two, occasionally a short symbol, and he added to it at intervals with the unhurried certainty of a craftsman laying courses of stone. Once he rose, went to the bookshelf, and retrieved a thin volume on the history of Renaissance bookbinding, which he consulted for perhaps 3 minutes before returning it and resuming his seat with a slight compression of the lips that might, in another man, have been a smile. "The ink is not consistent," he said at last without looking up. It was nearly 10 o'clock. I waited. There are 3 distinct tonal variations across the annotated pages. The difference is slight, invisible to the casual eye, and easily dismissed as the natural variation of a single bottle over time. But it is not that. He set the lens down and pushed the foolscap toward me across the table. "Look at the page numbers I've marked in the left column. Those annotated in the darkest tone are, without exception, in the first half of the volume. The middle tone appears exclusively in the latter half, and the lightest tone, the freshest ink, the most recent additions, clusters around pages which, you will observe, bear no relationship to the text they adjoin." I studied the table. The pattern was, once he had identified it, unmistakable, the kind of thing that becomes obvious immediately upon being pointed out, and seems incredible that one had not seen it independently. 3 separate sessions of annotation, I said, or 3 separate hands. 3 separate bottles of ink, Holmes corrected. The same hand throughout. I am quite certain of that. The letter formations are consistent, as is the pressure and the angle of stroke. A careful hand, Watson, and a disciplined one. Someone trained in the handling of manuscripts, accustomed to working with precision instruments and controlled movements. He paused, then added, with a deliberateness that I recognized as significant, "Someone who understood the restoration of old documents." He drew the foolscap back and directed my attention to a second column he had been constructing alongside the first. Here he had noted, beside each page reference, 1 or 2 letters enclosed in a small circle. "The annotations are not random," he said. "They are constructed to appear random. Lists of symbols, fragments of numerals, Latin abbreviations deployed just plausibly enough to suggest scholarly notation. But within each annotation, one letter is subtly distinguished from its neighbours, not emphasised in any dramatic fashion, no underlining, no alteration of size. The distinction is in the pressure of the stroke. The marked letter is written with a fractionally heavier hand, visible under the lens, invisible to the naked eye." I leaned forward, and when those letters are collected, when arranged by page number, they begin to form fragments. He indicated the right-hand column of his table, where he had gathered the extracted letters into groups. The fragments were still incomplete, isolated consonants, a vowel here and there, but they had the unmistakable quality of something coherent struggling to emerge, the way a figure appears in a fog before its outlines are fully legible. "Incomplete," I said. Holmes permitted himself that slight compression of the lips again. "Incomplete only if we assume the book itself is the message. It is not. The book is the medium. The message requires the reader to understand which pages are load-bearing, so to speak, and which are chaff added by another hand to obscure the pattern. He rose from the table and went to the fireplace, taking his pipe from the mantel. Ashcroft was a scholar of considerable ingenuity. He understood that anyone intercepting the manuscript would immediately examine the annotations. He therefore constructed his code to survive a superficial examination and reveal itself only to someone who knew precisely what to look for. And how do we determine which annotations are his, and which are the additions? Holmes lit his pipe and regarded the ceiling for a moment. Page numbers, he said. Ashcroft's annotations correspond to pages whose numerical value, when reduced by a consistent factor, produces a sequence. I have not yet determined the factor, but the pages bearing the freshest ink, our murderer's additions, follow no such sequence. They were inserted without knowledge of the underlying pattern. They obscure, but cannot replicate it. The implications of this settled over me with a weight that was not entirely comfortable. Then Ashcroft anticipated that someone might attempt to corrupt the message. He anticipated something of the sort, yes. A man who encodes an accusation in a manuscript he knows will change hands does not do so carelessly. Holmes drew on his pipe and let the smoke rise toward the ceiling in a slow column. He had discovered something that he could not prove through ordinary means, or dared not attempt to prove through ordinary means. The manuscript was his testament, his final scholarly argument, submitted, as it were, to a reader he trusted to have the patience to decipher it. Whittington, I suggested. Whittington was the conduit, not the intended recipient. Ashcroft could not have been certain who would acquire the volume from his estate. The code was constructed to be solved by anyone with sufficient knowledge of manuscript scholarship. It was addressed, in that sense, to a community rather than an individual. He paused. Or to a particular member of that community who would recognize the hand and understand the method. We sat for a time in silence. The fire had burned low and the fog outside had thickened again into the true density of a November midnight, so that the street below was nothing but occasional muffled sound and the distant wavering of a single lamp. "Holmes," I said at last, "when you say the message is incomplete as yet, how much more do you require?" He looked at the foolscap with an expression that was, for him, unusually candid. 3 more pages, perhaps 4. They carry the letters I have not yet been able to account for. He turned to me. And someone, our murderer, is aware that the message is not yet fully obscured. That is why the manuscript was opened today at Brooks's shop, and that is why further annotations have appeared in the last 18 hours. They are adding pages of chaff in the hope of burying the sequence beyond recovery. Then we are in a race, I said. We are. He took the lens up again and bent once more to the manuscript, and I intend to win it before breakfast. I went to bed at midnight and left him there, the lamp burning, the foolscap covered in his small neat figures, the fog pressing against the glass, engaged in that silent solitary contest with a dead man's code and a living man's fear. When I came down at 7 in the morning, Holmes was still in his chair. The tray from the previous evening remained untouched, but on the foolscap, beneath the columns I had examined the night before, a single line had been added in Holmes's precise hand. It read, "Maul," and then 4 letters I could not yet interpret. He had not quite won. But the fog, I felt, was beginning to thin. Chapter 5. Interviews Among the Living. Holmes slept for 3 hours, rose at 10, and by 11 o'clock was dressed, breakfasted, and in possession of a plan he had not yet seen fit to share with me. This was not unusual. He operated in the early stages of an investigation on the principle that a theory disclosed too soon is a theory prematurely tested, and he was sufficiently acquainted with my habits of expression to know that my face, in the presence of a suspect, was a less reliable instrument of concealment than his own. "We shall call on Miss Ashcroft first," he said, pulling on his gloves. "Then Larkspur, if he can be found at the university. Mallory I shall leave until this afternoon." "Any particular reason for that order?" I asked. "Mallory is the most composed of the 3. I wish to hear what the others say before I put anything to him that he might feel obliged to deny." He took his hat from the stand. "Also, I find that composed men are frequently most informative when they have had the longest opportunity to convince themselves they are not suspected." We found Miss Ashcroft at home and alone, which I suspected was not always the case. The sitting room had the quality of a space recently tidied to receive visitors, and there was a faint trace of burnt paper in the air that I noticed without immediately attaching significance to it. She greeted us with the same composed civility as before, though I thought her colour was slightly higher than our previous visit had warranted. Holmes declined the offered chair and stood near the window, which I had come to recognise as his preferred position when he wished to observe a subject's face in full light. "Miss Ashcroft," he began without preamble, "you mentioned yesterday that your uncle became fearful in his final weeks. I should like to press you on that point, if I may. Not fearful in general, fearful of something specific." She regarded her hands for a moment before answering. "He believed," she said carefully, "that someone intended to damage his reputation. Not his personal reputation, his scholarly reputation, which was to him considerably the more important of the two." "Did he name the person?" "Not to me directly. He said once, I remember it clearly because it struck me as unlike him, that a colleague had been building an edifice on rotten timber for 30 years, and that the day of reckoning was approaching." She looked up. "My uncle was not a dramatic man, Mr. Holmes. When he used that kind of language, it meant something precise." "And did he give any indication of how he intended to bring this reckoning about?" A pause of a different quality, shorter, but with more beneath it. "He was in correspondence with a publisher in Edinburgh. I believe he was preparing a monograph. Whether he completed it, I cannot say. I found no finished manuscript among his papers." She added, with a controlled deliberateness that suggested she had considered whether to say this, "I did find several draft pages. They were concerned with the history of manuscript forgery in Renaissance scholarship, methods of fabricating annotations, the use of period-appropriate inks, the kinds of errors that betray a modern hand working in an antique style." She paused once more. "I burned them. I did not think it appropriate to leave such accusations in a form that might cause distress to people who might not deserve it." Holmes was silent for a moment. I observed him absorb this information with the outward equanimity of a man receiving news of no particular consequence, though I knew the stillness for what it was. "You were protecting someone," he said, not unkindly. "I was protecting my uncle's memory," she replied, with a firmness that settled the matter as far as she was concerned. "He was not infallible, Mr. Holmes. Scholars sometimes persuade themselves of things they cannot demonstrate. I did not wish him remembered as a man who made accusations he could not prove." We left her 20 minutes later. On the pavement, Holmes walked in silence for half a block before speaking. "She burned the drafts 2 days ago," he said. "The smell of paper ash in that room was recent. She made that decision after Brooks's death, not before. She realised the matter was more serious than she had supposed. She realised her uncle's accusations may have been entirely correct, and that his papers placed someone she knew in a very dangerous position." He glanced at me. "She is not protecting Ashcroft's memory, Watson. She's protecting someone living, whether she knows it or not." Thomas Larkspur we found in a reading room at University College, surrounded by volumes of Greek epigraphy and looking considerably worse than he had at our first meeting. He rose when he saw us with the uncertain haste of a man caught between the instinct to appear cooperative and the instinct to flee, and settled into neither gracefully. Holmes sat down across from him with an ease that was itself a kind of pressure. "I want to ask you something straightforward," Holmes said, "and I should be grateful for an equally straightforward answer. In the course of your cataloguing work for Professor Ashcroft, did you ever observe anyone altering documents in his collection?" Larkspur's response was immediate and I thought genuine. "No, never." "Did you observe the Professor himself behaving with unusual caution regarding any particular item, locking materials away, restricting access, conducting any part of his work in your absence that he normally conducted openly?" The young man considered this with more care. "In September," he said slowly, "about a fortnight before he died, he asked me not to come in on Thursdays for a period. He said he had a private project that required the room. I thought nothing of it at the time. Academics have their private projects." "Thursdays," Holmes repeated quietly. 3 Thursdays in a row. Then he died, and I thought no more about it." Holmes asked several further questions of a technical nature, about the catalogue methods Larkspur employed, the materials he handled, his familiarity with Renaissance vellum, and the young man answered each with the conscientious detail of someone who wishes to be believed and has the advantage of telling the truth. His handwriting, which Holmes contrived to observe on the papers before him, bore no resemblance whatsoever to the crimsoned annotations. I could see Holmes register this with a minute inclination of the head. We parted from Larkspur with expressions of thanks and the assurance that he had been most helpful, which was entirely true, though not quite in the way the young man supposed. It was mid-afternoon by the time we presented ourselves at the door of Dr. Edwin Mallory's rooms in a well-maintained terrace near Russell Square. Mallory received us with the same unhurried courtesy he had shown before, offered us sherry, which Holmes declined and I accepted, and settled back in his chair with an expression of polite attention that would have deceived almost anyone. Holmes asked him about the professor's state of mind. Mallory spoke with measured sympathy of a colleague showing signs of strain in his final months. Overwork, mild confusion, a tendency toward unfounded suspicion that he delicately implied bordered on the irrational. "It is painful to say it," Mallory concluded, "but Lionel in his last weeks was not entirely himself. I fear he may have formed impressions of people close to him that were coloured by his condition." "Quite so," said Holmes. "One further question, if I may. Are you familiar with the process of manuscript restoration? The re-inking of faded marginalia, the stabilisation of period pigments, that sort of technical work?" Something moved very briefly across Mallory's face. It was not fear precisely, but it was its near neighbour. "I have a general familiarity with the literature," he said. "One accumulates a certain breadth of technical knowledge over a long career." "Of course." Holmes set down his untouched sherry glass and rose with a pleasant smile. "You have been most helpful, Dr. Mallory. I wonder, the bottle of crimson ink I noticed on your writing desk yesterday. A restoration ink, I take it?" The pause that followed was brief but absolute. "A sample," Mallory said, "sent by a colleague in Florence. I have been considering writing a paper on period pigment chemistry." "Fascinating subject," said Holmes warmly. "Good afternoon." On the stairs I asked, low-voiced, what he had concluded. "That Mallory is a very intelligent man," Holmes said, "who has just made the one mistake available to very intelligent men in difficult positions." He answered a question I did not quite ask. He settled his hat as we reached the street. I asked about the bottle. He told me where it came from. I had not inquired about that at all. Chapter 6. The Scholar's Secret. We were back at Baker Street by 4 o'clock. Holmes went immediately to the manuscript, which lay on the table precisely as he had left it, and stood over it for a moment without sitting down, in the manner of a man returning to a conversation that has been suspended rather than concluded. Then he went to the shelf where he kept his indices, those extraordinary commonplace books in which he had, over many years, organised an encyclopaedia of criminal and quasi-criminal intelligence that no official body could have rivalled, and drew out 2 volumes, which he carried to the table and set beside the manuscript without opening either. He remained standing. This, I had learned, meant that his thoughts were still in motion, and that sitting would feel to him like a premature commitment to conclusions not yet fully weighed. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what you know of the history of manuscript forgery." I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "A considerable trade in the Renaissance, I believe. Humanist scholars were susceptible to texts that confirmed their theories about classical antiquity. There were several celebrated cases, forged inscriptions, fabricated classical fragments. And in the modern period?" Less celebrated, perhaps, but I imagine it persists wherever scholarship and money intersect. It persists, Holmes said, wherever reputation intersects with evidence. Money is often secondary. He opened the first of the commonplace books and turned to a page near the middle, where he had pasted a clipping from an academic periodical alongside his own penciled annotations. 3 years ago, a controversy in the pages of the Journal of Classical Studies. A senior historian, unnamed in the public record, referred to in the correspondence only as a party to the dispute, was accused informally by a colleague of inserting fabricated marginal glosses into a 12th century Latin codex held at a private library in Wiltshire. The glosses appeared to support a specific historical claim the historian had advanced in a monograph of some significance. The accusation was never formally made. The colleague withdrew it. The matter was suppressed. He handed me the clipping. The periodical was dated 3 years prior, and the article was a dry discussion of editorial policy regarding disputed attributions. But Holmes had underlined a single sentence near the foot of the second column, and in the margin beside it had written, in his small, precise hand, one word: Mallory. I looked up at him. "The unnamed senior historian," I said. "The description fits in every particular. The monograph in question, tracked it down this morning while you slept, advanced a theory about the transmission of a specific Carolingian administrative practice into the Italian city-states. A narrow claim, but one with significant implications for Mallory's broader thesis on medieval institutional continuity, which had been his life's work for 3 decades. Without those glosses, the monograph's central argument rests on considerably thinner ground. And Ashcroft was the colleague who raised the accusation, and withdrew it." Holmes closed the commonplace book and set it aside. "That is the part that requires explanation. Ashcroft was not a timid man. Miss Ashcroft has made that plain enough. He withdrew the accusation, I believe, not because he lost his nerve, but because he lacked at that moment the specific proof that would have made the accusation irrefutable. An allegation of forgery against a scholar of Mallory's standing, unsupported by physical evidence, would have destroyed the accuser sooner than the accused. I turned this over in my mind. The fire had been made up while we were out, and the room was warm, the fog at the window reduced to a dull peripheral presence. There was something almost comfortable about the room's quiet that made the matter under discussion feel for a moment very far away, and then not far away at all. "So Ashcroft spent the intervening 3 years assembling that proof," I said. "He did, and he found it. I believe the nature of his discovery was this." Holmes sat down at last and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Mallory's forgery was technically accomplished, but not flawless. Ashcroft, examining the Wiltshire Codex in the course of his own research, identified anomalies in the disputed glosses, inconsistencies in the ink chemistry, letter forms that were too regular, an absence of the natural variation that characterizes genuine medieval annotation. Any one of these details might be dismissed. Collectively, they were damning. The drafts that Miss Ashcroft burned. Precisely. The monograph Ashcroft was preparing for the Edinburgh publisher would have laid out the technical evidence in full: ink analysis, paleographic comparison, the history of the Codex's custody. It would have been, had it been completed, the kind of meticulous scholarly demolition from which a reputation does not recover. But he died before it was finished. He died, Holmes said, in September, of what the death certificate records as cardiac failure. He was 63 and had a history of heart complaint. There is nothing, on the surface of it, to contradict that verdict. He paused, and I heard in the pause the particular weight of something held back. And yet, he was conducting, on those 3 private Thursdays, a separate operation. He was encoding his evidence in the manuscript, not as a substitute for the monograph, but as a safeguard. In the event that he was prevented from publishing, or that his papers were destroyed or suppressed, the coded accusation would survive in the manuscript, which was already destined for Whittington's catalogue, and thus for dispersal into the world of scholarship. He anticipated that Mallory might move against him. He was a careful man who had already once seen evidence suppressed. He took precautions. Holmes rose again and went to the window. The street below was quiet in the thickening dusk. A single cab moving along Baker Street with the unhurried patience of a vehicle whose passenger has nowhere urgent to be. The question of whether Mallory hastened Ashcroft's death is one I cannot yet answer with certainty. A man with a heart complaint, under stress, with access to a colleague who understands chemistry. It is suggestive, but suggestion is not proof. What I can establish is what happened afterward. He turned from the window. Mallory knew Ashcroft had been working on the exposé. He may have known about the Edinburgh publisher. After Ashcroft's death, when the collection was dispersed and the manuscript passed to Whittington, Mallory understood that whatever Ashcroft had hidden was now beyond his direct control. He had to find it before anyone else did. He gained access to the manuscript through a visit to Whittington's shop, the details of which I intend to press Whittington upon tomorrow, and recognized that the Marginalia were not decorative. He began adding his own annotations to obscure the pattern. But Brooks had seen the manuscript during the same period, I said, following the thread, and Brooks understood what he saw. Brooks was a second-hand dealer with, I suspect, a more acute intelligence than his reputation suggested. He recognized the annotations as a coded message, perhaps not its precise content, but its nature, and he made the catastrophic error of communicating that recognition to someone. Holmes's expression was, for a moment, quite bleak. Mallory silenced him, arranged it to resemble the suicide that a man of Brooks's financial circumstances might plausibly have chosen, and then continued adding to the manuscript, racing to complete the obscurement before the code could be fully read. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson moved about with her customary evening purpose, and the small sounds of the household were oddly steadying. "Holmes," I said carefully, "you're describing a man who was very likely killed twice." "I am." He returned to the table and picked up the manuscript with both hands, holding it for a moment as though taking its measure. "A man who spent 30 years constructing a reputation, and who discovered that a single colleague had the patience and the rigour to dismantle it entirely. Such a man does not stop at one death." He set the volume down again. "Which is precisely why I intend to move quickly." He drew the foolscap toward him, uncapped his pen, and bent once more to the table. I watched his hand move across the paper, steady, deliberate, unhurried, and thought of Ashcroft at his own table, on 3 private Thursdays, pressing a message into the margins of an old book, placing his trust in the patience of an unknown future reader. He had chosen better than he knew. Chapter 7. The Convenient Suspect. The morning brought a development that Holmes had not anticipated, though when I observed his expression upon hearing the news I could not be entirely certain of that. He was capable, on occasion, of a retrospective composure so convincing that it was difficult to distinguish genuine surprise from the rapid assimilation of something he had already considered as a possibility and simply not expected to arrive quite so soon. The news came from Lestrade, who appeared at Baker Street shortly after 9 with the self-possessed air of a man delivering a verdict. He accepted Mrs. Hudson's offer of coffee with more warmth than he usually extended to such courtesies, settled himself in the basket chair, and informed us that Thomas Larkspur had been taken into custody the previous evening. Holmes set down his coffee cup without drinking from it. "On what grounds?" he asked. "On rather solid ones, as it happens." Lestrade produced his notebook with the deliberate ease of a man who has rehearsed his presentation. First, access. Larkspur had unrestricted use of Ashcroft's library for the better part of 2 years. He handled the manuscript on his own admission. Second, motive. The young man has debts, gambling debts, not inconsiderable ones contracted over the past 18 months. We have spoken with 2 creditors. The amounts are not trifling. "Gambling debts are not forgery," Holmes observed. "No, but the theory is this." Lestrade turned a page. Larkspur identified the Renaissance manuscript as potentially more valuable than catalogued, a not uncommon thing with Ashcroft's holdings, apparently. and inserted the annotations himself with the aim of presenting it as a document of greater historical significance, thereby inflating its sale price. Whittington would have been the unwitting instrument. When Brooks, who understood the manuscript trade, recognised the annotations as false and threatened to expose the scheme, Larkspur silenced him. A silence followed. I found myself, to my own discomfort, running over the theory as Lestrade had presented it, and discovering that it was not without a certain structural plausibility. The access was undeniable. The debts provided what a jury would recognise as motive. And Larkspur's agitation at our first meeting, which I had attributed to the anxiety of an innocent man under scrutiny, could equally be read the other way. There is also a witness, Lestrade added, with the quietness of a man saving his strongest card. A costermonger who works the corner of Chandos Lane identifies a young man of Larkspur's description entering the street on the afternoon before Brooks's body was found. He was there for perhaps 40 minutes. Holmes was on his feet. He had not made any visible decision to rise. He simply was standing, moving toward the table where the manuscript lay. Did the witness identify Larkspur from a photograph or from a description, he asked. Lestrade hesitated fractionally. A description? We are arranging a formal identification. A description, Holmes repeated, in a tone that was entirely neutral, and therefore not neutral at all. What was Larkspur's explanation for the afternoon in question? He claims he was at the British Museum reading room. We are attempting to verify it. Attempting, Holmes said. He picked up the manuscript and held it, not opening it, simply holding it with both hands as he had done the evening before. Lestrade, I do not say that Larkspur is innocent. I say that before you proceed further, there is a question you have not yet put to yourself, and it is this. Who benefits from Larkspur's arrest at this particular moment? Lestrade's expression arranged itself into the careful blankness that I had come to read as the sign of a man who does not intend to be shifted, but is not entirely comfortable with his position. The evidence benefits from it, he said. The evidence points to Larkspur. Evidence has no interests. People do. Holmes set the manuscript down and turned to face him fully. Consider the timing. Larkspur is arrested not after a patient accumulation of evidence over days of inquiry, but within 48 hours of my becoming involved in the matter. The witness in Chandos Lane comes forward with useful specificity. The financial difficulties, which have presumably been a fact of Larkspur's life for 18 months, suddenly become known to the police. Someone has been directing your attention, Lestrade, and doing it with considerable efficiency. Lestrade was quiet for a moment. He was not a stupid man. I'd always thought him underestimated in Holmes's occasional dismissals, and at this moment his face showed the particular quality of a capable officer genuinely reconsidering. "You're saying the case against Larkspur was constructed," he said. "I am saying it was accelerated. Some elements may be genuine, the debts, the access, the association with Brooks. A good fabrication always incorporates genuine materials. It is cheaper and more durable." Holmes went to the window. "But consider the annotations themselves. I have spent 2 evenings with this manuscript, Lestrade. The technical knowledge required to produce those marks, the correct period in chemistry, the understanding of medieval paleographic conventions, the patience and discipline of the hand, is not the knowledge of a research assistant cataloguing secondary sources in Greek and Latin texts. It is the knowledge of a specialist in manuscript restoration. Larkspur's work was entirely in printed materials. He told us so himself, and I find no reason to disbelieve him." "You have someone else in mind," Lestrade said. It was not quite a question. "I have the evidence of the manuscript, the evidence of the ink bottle, and the evidence of a man who answered a question I did not ask." Holmes turned from the window. "I require 2 more days, Lestrade. Hold Larkspur on whatever holding charge the evidence supports, but do not close the case. 2 days. Lestrade drummed his fingers once on the arm of the basket chair, then stood. 2 days, Mr. Holmes. I am not promising more than that. There is pressure from above to resolve this quickly. The connection to a university college professor makes it a matter of some public sensitivity. 2 days will be sufficient. When Lestrade had gone, I expressed to Holmes the unease that had been accumulating in me throughout the interview. "The young man is sitting in a cell," I said. "He is not guilty, and every hour he remains there is an injustice." "Every hour he remains there is also a measure of safety," Holmes replied, and seeing my expression he continued more quietly. "Our murderer has now achieved his immediate objective. Larkspur is arrested, the inquiry appears to be resolved, and the pressure on the manuscript, and on whoever holds it, diminishes accordingly. A man who has killed twice to protect himself will not risk a third action when the official machinery is already moving in his preferred direction." He paused. "Larkspur is safer in custody than at liberty at this particular moment. I do not say it with satisfaction. I say it as a fact." I accepted this, reluctantly, because it had the unhappy quality of being correct. The remainder of the morning Holmes devoted to correspondence. He wrote 3 letters in quick succession, sealed them himself, and dispatched them by the page who attended to such errands. He did not tell me to whom they were addressed, and I did not ask, having learned that these intermediate communications, to contacts in the worlds of chemistry, academia, and the more rarefied regions of the book trade, were the tendons of his method, invisible until the moment they drew something into place. In the afternoon he sat for 2 hours with the manuscript in the foolscap, working in a silence so absolute that I twice checked that he was still breathing. At the end of this period he set the pen down, looked at what he had written, and remained motionless for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was without turning from the table. "The placement of the annotations, Watson," he said quietly. "That is the detail. That is the one thing that cannot be explained by any other hypothesis. I've been circling it for 2 days, and there is no other interpretation." "What do you mean?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. He simply tapped the open page before him with one finger, a page in the deep interior of the volume, where the text pressed close to the tightly sewn binding, and said nothing more. I crossed to the table and looked at the page he indicated. The annotation ran along the innermost margin, pressed so close to the gutter of the binding that a portion of each letter was swallowed by the shadows of the spine. To have written there at all, the volume must have been fully open flat, the kind of opening that strains and eventually breaks the binding of a tightly sewn book. And yet the binding, I could see plainly, was entirely undisturbed. I looked at Holmes. He was watching me with the quiet patience of a teacher waiting for a student to reach the final step of a proof they have very nearly completed. I said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. But the understanding was beginning, and Holmes could see that it was, and that was sufficient for the moment. Chapter 8. The One Detail. Holmes did not explain himself that evening. He rarely did at the moment of discovery, preferring to let a conclusion mature overnight before presenting it, as though premature disclosure might somehow thin the substance of what he had found. I had long ceased to find this exasperating, and had arrived at a species of trust in the rhythm of it, the gathering silence, the concentrated stillness, and then the morning clarity. I went to bed at 11. Holmes was still at the table. By 9 the following morning he had slept, shaved, and consumed a breakfast of which Mrs. Hudson approved, and was seated in his armchair in a state of collected readiness that I associated with the final phase of an inquiry. The manuscript lay closed on the table. The foolscap was folded and placed within it as bookmark. He had, I noticed, tied the oilskin back around the volume with a knot more secure than any Whittington had used. "Sit down, Watson," he said, with a particular quality of invitation that meant he intended to speak at length, and wished me to be comfortable for it. "I am going to show you something, and then I am going to explain what it means, and then I am going to ask whether you see any objection to my reasoning. You are, in my experience, a more reliable corrective than you give yourself credit for." I sat. He rose, unwrapped the manuscript and placed it open before me on the table, standing to one side as a lecturer stands beside a demonstration. "The annotation I showed you last night," he said. "Inner margin, page 147. You observe that it runs very close to the gutter of the binding. Cast your eye now at the binding itself and tell me what you see. I examined it with care. The binding was of a style consistent with the volume's age, tightly sewn gatherings covered in brown calf, the spine flush and firm. The pages near the centre of the book, where page 147 fell, pressed together with the snug resistance of undisturbed paper. I worked the volume gently toward a full opening, and felt the resistance increase sharply well before the pages lay flat. "It will not open fully," I said. "The sewing is too tight. The spine has never been strained." "Precisely. Now look at the annotation." I looked. The crimson letters ran to within perhaps 3 millimetres of the innermost fold of the page, each letter fully formed, uncompressed, written with the steady hand of someone who had the page lying perfectly flat before them. The implication arrived with the quiet certainty of a long sum arriving at its correct total. "Those letters could not have been written in the book as it is currently bound," I said slowly. "The page would have needed to lie completely flat, which means they were written before the book was in its present binding," Holmes said. "The volume was rebound after Ashcroft's death. I have confirmed it. I wrote yesterday to Mr. Gerald Foss of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association, who handled the physical processing of Ashcroft's estate. Foss informs me, in the reply I received this morning, that 2 volumes from the collection were sent for rebinding before sale, as their covers were damaged. This manuscript was one of them. The rebinding was completed in the first week of October." He let this settle for a moment. "Ashcroft died in September," I said. "The rebinding was done after his death, which means the annotations on page 147, and presumably others in similarly inaccessible positions, were written by Ashcroft himself before the book was rebound, when it still lay flat." Before his death. Written on those private Thursdays, when the pages could be opened fully on his desk without straining the binding, because the binding he was working with was the original loose-backed cover, already damaged, already coming apart at the joints. A damaged binding opens completely flat. It offers no resistance at all. Holmes returned to his chair with the movement of a man whose case is made, and who is now simply ordering the presentation of it. "The annotations attributed to Ashcroft are not forgeries introduced after the fact. They are his own work, completed during his lifetime, encoding his accusation in the only medium he believed would survive intact. And the newer annotations, the ones in the less oxidized ink, the ones added after the rebinding, written by Mallory in the week since the manuscript passed to Whittington. Mallory had access to the volume. I pressed Whittington on this point yesterday evening by telephone, and he confirmed that Mallory visited the shop on one occasion, ostensibly to assist with the valuation of the Ashcroft collection. Whittington, who trusted him as a representative of the academic world that had produced the collection, left him alone with the materials for a period of time he estimated at 40 minutes. Holmes interlaced his fingers. Mallory understood the nature of Ashcroft's code, but not its precise mechanism. He could see that something was hidden in the Marginalia. He could not fully decipher it without the key. So he did the only thing available to him. He added more annotations, hoping to overwhelm the signal with noise. But the new annotations could not reach the innermost margins, I said, following it now with complete clarity. Because the book had been rebound. The tight new binding prevented him from writing where Ashcroft had written. He could add marks to the accessible portions of each page, but not to those deep inner positions that Ashcroft had used for his most critical letters. The rebinding, which was done as a routine act of conservation, became Ashcroft's unintended posthumous ally. It preserved the most important letters of the acrostic beyond Mallory's reach. Holmes's expression held that quality I had observed before, not precisely satisfaction, but the austere appreciation of an elegance he had not designed. Mallory wrote around the message. He could not write over it, and so the original hand survives, embedded in the margins, legible to anyone who knows what page numbers to examine and what binding history to consult. I sat back and regarded the volume with a feeling that was difficult to name precisely, something between admiration for the dead man's ingenuity and sorrow for the circumstances that had made such ingenuity necessary. "The letters in those deep inner positions," I said. "Do they complete the acrostic?" Holmes took the foolscap from within the volume and placed it before me without speaking. The table he had constructed over 3 days of work occupied perhaps 2/3 of the page. In the rightmost column, where the extracted letters had been assembled, the fragments I had seen 2 days ago, isolated, suggestive, incomplete, had been extended. The sequence was still not fully resolved, but it was no longer ambiguous. 4 letters stood clear at the head: M, A, L, L. Below them, in brackets, Holmes had written in pencil the 2 further letters he expected the remaining inner margin pages to yield. The whole, when complete, would read unmistakably. "You know who wrote the Marginalia," I said. "I have known since yesterday afternoon," Holmes replied. "What I now possess is the physical proof that Ashcroft's annotations predate the rebinding, which places them beyond Mallory's reach and beyond any accusation of posthumous interference. It also demonstrates conclusively that the inner margin letters, the most critical ones, could only have been placed there by someone working on the original loose binding. That person was Ashcroft. No one else had access to the volume in its damaged state, and no one else could have written in those positions after October." He stood, took his coat from the hook, and held it for a moment before putting it on. "I shall need one further consultation," he said. "There is a matter of chemistry I wish to have independently confirmed, the ink composition of Ashcroft's annotations versus Mallory's additions. I wrote yesterday to a colleague at the Royal Institution. His reply should arrive before noon." He paused at the door. "After that, I think it is time to bring the circle together." He left me at the table with the manuscript and the foolscap and the quiet, and I sat for a moment looking at the page. Outside, the November fog had lifted at last, and a pale, provisional winter sunlight lay across the table in a thin rectangle, illuminating the crimson marks with a clarity they had not possessed in any of the grey days preceding. It seemed fitting, somehow, that Ashcroft's message should choose this particular morning to be fully legible. Chapter 9. Holmes explains the marginal code. The reply from the Royal Institution arrived at 11:30. Holmes read it standing in the hallway, handed it to me without comment, and went directly to the writing table. The letter was brief and technical, composed by a Dr. Ambrose Trevithick, whom Holmes had evidently consulted before on matters requiring chemical precision. Trevithick confirmed that the 2 ink samples Holmes had submitted by messenger the previous afternoon, designated Sample A and Sample B, their origins unspecified, were chemically distinct. Sample A contained a ferrous gallitannate compound, consistent with a commercially available restoration ink of the kind supplied by specialist dealers in Florence and Rome. Sample B showed a different base chemistry altogether: iron gall with a hematite pigment suspension, consistent with a private preparation mixed to approximate the chromatic properties of period cinnabar annotation. Sample B, in plain terms, was the work of a man who had made his own ink with some care. Sample A had come from a bottle. Holmes dispatched 3 further notes before noon. One was to Lestrade. One, as I discovered later, was to Whittington. The third he sealed and addressed in a hand more deliberate than his usual rapid script, and I observed that the envelope was directed to an address in Russell Square. To Mallory, then. He was inviting the man he intended to expose. By 3 o'clock, Baker Street had filled itself with an atmosphere I recognised from previous cases of Holmes's construction. That particular quality of a room awaiting the arrival of something that cannot be recalled once it has entered. Mrs. Hudson had brought fresh coal and an additional chair from the landing. Holmes had arranged the manuscript at the centre of the table with the foolscap beside it, both visible from every seat in the room. He himself stood at the fireplace, his back to it, in the stance of a man who intends to speak and has decided precisely where to begin. Whittington arrived first. looking relieved at the invitation and nervous about its implications. Lestrade came minutes later, accompanied by a detective constable he stationed in the corridor without being asked to do so, an arrangement of which Holmes gave no sign of approval or otherwise. Miss Ashcroft arrived in black, self-contained and watchful, and took the chair nearest the door with the quiet precision of someone who has prepared themselves for news they are not certain they wish to hear. Larkspur released that morning at Holmes's specific request to Lestrade, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 2 nights in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, sat beside her, and I noted that she acknowledged his presence with a brief firm nod that communicated in the economy of her manner a good deal of unspoken apology. Mallory was the last to arrive. He entered with the same unhurried composure he had maintained throughout, greeted the assembled company with the courtesy of a man accustomed to chairing academic meetings, and accepted the remaining chair with a slight inclination of the head toward Holmes that might, in another setting, have been collegiate. Holmes waited until Mrs. Hudson had closed the door. "I am grateful to you all for coming," he began, in the measured tone he adopted when addressing a group rather than an individual. "I shall be as concise as the complexity of the matter permits. I ask that no one speak until I have finished, after which I shall answer whatever questions are put to me." He lifted the manuscript from the table. "This volume," he said, "is a Latin treatise of the mid-16th century, unremarkable in itself. It became remarkable when Professor Lionel Ashcroft, in the final 3 weeks of his life, used it as the medium for a coded accusation he was unable to make through ordinary scholarly channels. The code is an acrostic, constructed from letters embedded in the Marginalia by means of a consistent variation in stroke pressure, a technique requiring both patience and considerable familiarity with the conventions of manuscript annotation." He set the volume down again. Professor Ashcroft had spent 3 years assembling evidence for a charge of systematic scholarly fraud. The charge was directed at a colleague who had, over the course of a distinguished career, fabricated marginal annotations in at least one rare historical document in order to support claims central to his published work. No one spoke. The fire settled once in the grate. Mallory's expression had not moved. Holmes lifted the foolscap. When the letters embedded in Ashcroft's annotations are extracted and arranged by page number, they form the following message. He paused, not for dramatic effect, but with the precision of a man ensuring he will not need to repeat himself. "Mallory, forger." The word forger occupied the room with the solidity of something physical. Whittington's head turned toward Mallory with the reflex of a man who cannot prevent the movement. Larkspur had gone very still. Miss Ashcroft's eyes closed briefly and then opened again, and in the interval between I thought I saw something that was not grief and not surprise, but the particular expression of a person receiving confirmation of something they had feared and hoped simultaneously to be wrong about. Mallory said nothing. His hands, folded on his knee, did not move. "The annotations in Ashcroft's hand," Holmes continued, addressing the room but watching Mallory, "were written during 3 private sessions in September, when the manuscript lay in its original damaged binding, which opened completely flat. I have confirmed through correspondence with the estate's bookseller that the volume was rebound in early October after Ashcroft's death. Several annotations, including those bearing the most critical letters of the acrostic, are positioned in the innermost margin, within 3 millimeters of the gutter. They could only have been written when the pages lay fully open. The current binding will not permit that opening. Therefore those letters predate the rebinding. Therefore they were written by Ashcroft in his lifetime, before his death in September." He let this stand for a moment. A second hand subsequently added further annotations, using a commercially supplied restoration ink of Florentine origin, in an attempt to overwhelm the acrostic with surrounding noise. This second hand could not reach the innermost positions because the new binding prevented full opening of the pages. "The second hand is chemically distinct from the first. I have the written confirmation of a Fellow of the Royal Institution." He took Trevithick's letter from the table and placed it with the foolscap. "Leonard Brooks," Holmes said, and his voice had shifted almost imperceptibly. Not harder, but quieter. Recognised the nature of the annotations when he examined the manuscript at Mr. Whittington's premises. He communicated his suspicion. To whom, I cannot be entirely certain, though the evidence of the name list in his desk drawer places Dr. Mallory among those he had identified as connected to the manuscript. He was silenced before he could act upon his discovery. The method, laudanum administered in sufficient quantity, the scene arranged to suggest self-destruction, the door latch manipulated with a thin implement through the warped doorframe, was the work of a careful and unhurried mind. Mallory spoke then, for the first time since entering the room. His voice was level and entirely controlled. "This is a construction, Mr. Holmes, an elaborate and ingenious one, I grant you, but a construction." "It is a demonstration," Holmes replied. "There is a difference. A construction requires the suppression of inconvenient facts. A demonstration requires only their arrangement." He indicated the manuscript, the foolscap, and the letter in their order on the table. "The binding history is documented. The ink chemistry is independently confirmed. The acrostic is legible to any competent paleographer. You are welcome to dispute any element of it before a jury, which will have the considerable advantage of hearing all three simultaneously." Something shifted in Mallory's bearing then. Not collapse, not the theatrical surrender of a stage villain, but a gradual yielding of tension, like a structure that has been stressed beyond its tolerances and arrives at failure by a process too quiet to be dramatic. He looked at the manuscript for a long moment, and what was in his face I could not have described precisely, but it contained within it some shadow of the 30 years he had spent, and everything he had made of them, and everything he had done to preserve them. Lestrade moved to the door and spoke quietly to the constable in the corridor. Holmes had turned to the fireplace and stood looking into it, his part in the proceedings, for the moment, entirely done. "You attempted to hide a message," he said, not turning, his voice addressed more to the fire than to the room. "By writing more of it, Dr. Mallory. Yet the original hand is always betrayed by the patience of its strokes." Mallory was taken out. The room was very quiet. Through the window the last of the afternoon light lay pale and level across the rooftops of Baker Street, and somewhere below the ordinary life of the city resumed its indifferent passage, quite unconscious of what had just been concluded in the room above. Chapter 10. Watson's Reflection. In the days that followed Mallory's arrest, London did what London invariably does with scandals of the educated class. It absorbed the news quietly, discussed it in clubs and common rooms with a restraint that was itself a form of sensation, and then passed on to other matters, leaving the damage to settle where it would without the inconvenience of sustained attention. The newspapers were less restrained. The story had, as editors quickly perceived, all the necessary ingredients. A distinguished career unmasked, a dead scholar vindicated, a young man wrongfully accused and released, a murder dressed as suicide in a bookseller's shop. The Daily Telegraph ran 3 columns on the Wednesday, and the Illustrated London News followed with a longer piece on what its writer called, with the confident imprecision of popular journalism, the most extraordinary case of academic criminality in the present century. Holmes read both pieces at breakfast, made one short observation about the inaccuracy of a particular passage, and turned to his chemical monograph without further comment. The legal proceedings took their course with the methodical unhurry of the English criminal law. Mallory was charged with the wilful murder of Leonard Brooks and remanded for trial. A second charge relating to the suspected death of Professor Ashcroft was examined by the coroner and found, on the available evidence, to be insufficiently supported for criminal prosecution, a conclusion that Holmes received without visible dissatisfaction, having told me privately that he thought it probable but could not, on the evidence alone, make it certain, and that he had no interest in pursuing a case beyond what the evidence would honestly bear. Trevithick's chemical analysis was formally entered into the prosecution papers. The testimony of Gerald Foss regarding the October rebinding was taken by affidavit. The foolscap, which Holmes had retained in his own hand throughout, was delivered to Lestrade in a sealed envelope with a brief explanatory note, whose economy of language, I was told by Lestrade afterward, struck the prosecuting counsel as remarkable. Mallory did not contest the evidence at committal. His solicitor entered a plea of not guilty, as solicitors are obliged to do, but the counsel retained for the prosecution described the physical evidence as among the most coherent he had encountered in 30 years at the bar. The trial was set for the following spring. I called upon Miss Ashcroft on the Thursday of that week alone, without Holmes. It seemed to me that certain conversations are better conducted without his particular quality of intelligence in the room, not because that intelligence is unkind, but because it is so complete that it leaves very little space for the kind of imprecise human exchange that is sometimes what a person most requires. She received me in the same sitting room, the same upright posture, the same composed economy of expression. She thanked me for coming. I said something inadequate about being glad that the matter was resolved, and she received my inadequacy with the gracious patience of a woman who had been receiving other people's inadequacies in connection with her uncle's death for several months. Then she said something that I have thought about since more than once. My uncle knew Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I beg your pardon, that he might not live to see Mallory exposed. I understand that now. He was not a well man, and he was under considerable strain, and I think he knew it. The manuscript was not a last resort. It was a deliberate choice. He wanted the truth to exist somewhere that was not dependent on him. I said that I thought her uncle had been a remarkable man. He was a patient man, she said, and the word patient, in her mouth, carried the weight of the highest praise she knew how to give. He understood that some truths require more time than the person who discovers them has available. He simply arranged for them to take care of themselves. We sat for a few minutes longer, speaking of less consequential things, and when I rose to leave she pressed my hand briefly and thanked me again, not for the investigation, I thought, but for the visit itself. I walked back through Bloomsbury in the thin December cold, past the great grey facade of the museum, through streets that smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, and felt the particular melancholy that attaches itself sometimes to concluded cases. The sense that the resolution of a problem, however just, does not restore what the problem has consumed. Larkspur were encountered by accident a fortnight later in a reading room at the London Library. He was working again, surrounded by the Greek epigraphy he had put aside during the worst of it, and he looked, if not recovered, then at least returned to himself. He greeted me with a warmth that I found unexpectedly moving and asked me to convey his gratitude to Holmes. I told him I would, and did, and Holmes received it with a nod that acknowledged the sentiment without dwelling on it. Whittington sent a case of claret to Baker Street with a note of thanks that was more articulate than most. Holmes donated the claret to Mrs. Hudson, who distributed it, with her customary practicality, among deserving purposes. The manuscript itself was, after some deliberation between the estate and the relevant legal authorities, deposited with the manuscript collection of the British Museum, where it may still be examined by qualified scholars. A small note in the catalogue, I am told, records the nature of the annotations without specifying their history. The inner margin letters of the acrostic are visible, under appropriate magnification, to anyone who knows where to look. Holmes and I spoke of the case only once more at any length, on an evening in late December when the cold had driven us both to either side of a good fire, and the day had contracted to the narrow warm circle of the sitting-room. I had been reading, or attempting to read, and had found my attention drifting, as it sometimes does, back over the preceding weeks. "Holmes," I said, "I have been thinking about Ashcroft." He looked up from the monograph he was annotating. "Specifically," I continued, "about the degree of trust the whole scheme required. He had no way of knowing that the manuscript would reach someone capable of reading the code. He had no way of knowing that Mallory would not succeed in obscuring it entirely. He simply put it out into the world and trusted that the right reader would find it." Holmes set down his pen. He regarded the fire for a moment with the expression of a man turning a thought over to examine its underside. "It is not entirely unlike writing," he said at last. A man sets down what he knows with the care he can manage and releases it, and hopes that the patience he invested in the composition will find an answering patience in whoever reads it. He cannot guarantee the reader. He can only guarantee the work. This was more reflective than Holmes usually permitted himself, and I did not press it further, having learned that his deeper thoughts on human things are like the inner margin annotations he had spent so many late hours deciphering, present and legible, but only to those who know how to hold the page. I wrote up the case that winter, in the evenings when Baker Street was quiet and the fog had returned to its customary tenure of the street outside. I have found, over many years of recording Holmes's investigations, that the act of writing imposes upon events a shape they do not always possess while one is living through them, a beginning, a movement, a conclusion, and that this shape, however artificial, is not without its value. It allows the mind to set a thing down, and having set it down, to rest. What stays with me, finally, is not the ingenuity of the code, though that was considerable, nor the precision of Holmes's unravelling of it, though I have tried to do it justice here. What stays with me is the image of Ashcroft at his desk on those 3 Thursdays, the damage binding open flat before him, the crimson ink precisely mixed, pressing his knowledge into the margins of an old book, with the unhurried care of a man who has accepted that he will not himself witness the result. He had done what he could with what he had and what time remained to him. Holmes has often told me that the truth rarely shouts. More often it waits patiently in the margin, where only the attentive reader will ever notice it. I had not appreciated until this case how much courage that kind of patience requires.